You've likely read or heard about gross domestic product, or its famous acronym GDP, when listening or reading about the state of the economy. But what does it really mean? And how important is it to agriculture and food markets? When you look at your business, you have a pretty obvious and straightforward tool to evaluate how well it's doing. You can use net income or profits. It's the same thing when we speak of agriculture or a sector in particular. We can look at gross revenues minus expenses and get a straight reading of how the sector or the industry is doing. But when we want to evaluate the strength of the overall economy, things get a little more complicated. GDP represents the total dollar value of all goods and services produced over a specific period. We usually refer to four components of GDP: consumption, business investment, government spending, and net exports, that is, exports minus imports. There's been plenty of criticisms around GDP and its ability to evaluate the standard of living within a society, but I have yet to see an alternative that is truly appealing. GDP is important because it is connected to food consumption. Let's use meat as an example. This is a nice illustration built by the Department of Agriculture in Australia, relying on publicly available data. It shows per capita meat consumption of various countries as a function of the evolution of GDP on a per capita basis. The first thing that stands out is that increases in meat consumption are associated with increases in GDP. There's a positive relationship between the two. In that sense, any news that the global economy is slowing down, as measured by GDP, would not be a good news because it would suggest that meat consumption is likely to slow down. Second, the stage of economic development matters. Look at China. In the early stages of economic growth, any growth in GDP triggered a large increase in meat consumption. Now meat consumption is still growing, but at a slower pace. For countries like Canada and other Western nations, increases or decreases in GDP will have less of an impact. But there'll be some impact. When GDP slows, households visit restaurants less frequently, and some types of food might see their overall consumption be impacted. This brings me to my last point. We must be careful about blindly associating changes in GDP with changes in food consumption. What matters from a food consumption standpoint is prices of the various foods relative to their alternatives, the preferences of consumers, and income. GDP is an imperfect measure of income and should not be the only factor we look at to determine future trends or growth in food consumption. For example, much has been said about the GDP growth rate of China slowing down to under 7%, as opposed to the double-digit growth rates observed more than a decade ago. But what really matters is income of Chinese households. Income is also an impact on preferences. Higher income means a preference for healthier, higher quality food. So what is really driving purchases of the commodities or products you grow on your farm? Buyers of agricultural products are often not consumers. They can be processors, handlers, wholesalers, etc. So something to think about is this: do you have a clear line of sight to consumers in Canada or abroad to understand what drives the demand you face?